Hello. Thanks for tuning in to my conversation with Johannes. Originally, this was recorded for his channel, Classical Philosophy. Links are below for his channel. Um, in this conversation, we go deep into circling and the deeper distinctions and what essentially circling really practices, right, around these deep human capacities about listening. That on one level, circling is very personal. However, the thing I've come to discover is to be personal as a human being is to be a being who is deeply concerned about being as such. And so, Johannes, being the philosopher that he is, the thinker that he is, really drew that part, I think, of the conversation out around circling and around my experience of it. So I hope you really enjoy it. It was awesome, as always, as all my conversations with Johannes are. They're enlightening and deep and leave me thinking for a long time. Okay, so some housekeeping. If you are interested in circling, we have open to everybody events to check it out on Thursday, 7 p.m. Or, I'm sorry, 6 p.m., 6 to 9, California time. Um, And then we have a weekend coming up this weekend. We still have open spots if you want to register for that. And we also have opened for registration our year-long training, which is training in the art of facilitating circling, which is not, remember, it's like when you think about that, it's not circling is not a technique. It's not technique. It's a deep capacity. So it's a very, very different sense in which to learn how to circle fundamentally is a profound learning of how to be profoundly yourself in the moment, in the world, in the relationship, in the circle, essentially, that you find yourself in. So that's a year-long process, and check it all out. Links for all that are below. Enjoy.
I'm here with Guy Sangstock. Probably many know him. So Guy is the discoverer of circling, and you will let us know a bit what circling is, and then let's see where it goes from there. Guy, it's good to have you.
Yeah, it's good to have you too. It's good to be had. So I'm enjoying our connection, and I think what we connect about, right, is essentially like the same place that circling for me is essentially the same conversation, really. Um, I guess what circling has evolved into is it's you could say it's taking seriously um, what can happen in human relationship and conversation and what can open up there, and essentially making it a practice, um, to kind of a practice of deep presence and deep listening and speaking and language and all of the things that can happen when two people come to come into relationship. And I think, on some level, like if I were to hear that, if I were just listening, right, and I don't know anything about it, I'd be like, well, I mean, what's kind of so like, why do you need to make a practice? Why don't you just go talk to somebody, right? Um, but I think it's important. The thing I've come to realize with circling is it first of all, it's nobody invented circling, right? It wasn't like it's not like Guy and his friends were like, let's invent something. It was more like we had an experience together, and particularly myself and my friend Jerry Candelaria out of this experience with a group of friends of ours and had this profoundly deep conversation that was just stunning and like enlightening and transformative, if you will. And it stood out for Jerry and I as distinct from all the other kind of enlightening deep things going on at that time. And we both kind of pointed back to it and went, that, we didn't have a word for it. And I was like, yeah, that. And he's like, we didn't know exactly what we were pointing back to, but it struck us. And we just spontaneously just shook hands and just committed to it and turned towards it. And I've been, in some sense, circling has developed out of that relationship with it. Right. And so on some level, I feel like I've continually discovered what circling is. Um, and it did go, and in that is when I started reading Heidegger, and I started getting into philosophy just on my own and
Yeah.
grappling with it. And I think the language of phenomenology, and particularly the way that in order to read people like Heidegger and Kant and a lot of the continental philosophers, there's this kind of strange way where, in some sense, they're they're seeking to know the thing that's the most close to us, and it's not this far out knowing what's beyond the horizon. It's more like what's the thing that's, how is anything intelligible at all? What is, how do we even know that we are? And in some sense, we live out an understanding of that. We have to, in order to even like breathe practically. But but there's this kind of level where it's very concealed, a- a- simultaneously in that enacting of it. And when you start to get in a relationship with people and you start to want to really honestly know what's happening, right? Like right now between us and what's going on in our lives, and you just have an honest conversation about what's so, y- where you got to look is is closer in, right, than you usually know to look. And I think that, and although I didn't understand it at the time, I think that's what really struck me about reading Heidegger is that, and here I am in art school, I'm, making my living as a personal trainer and a body worker and a stripper, right, in San Francisco at the time, going to this, like, going into huge amounts of debt, to art school at the San Francisco Art Institute, which now no longer exists. But at the time, it was the most avant-garde place in the universe, and and I would go to Barnes and Noble, and I would sit there and, no one bought Being in Time, so it was all mine basically, and I just drink coffee and read Being in Time for hours. I didn't have any idea what I was actually reading, but there was something that spoke to me, and so I just kept. I don't know why, but I just kept going back into it, and it's only in retrospect that I started to realize what was happening for me there. And it was a few years later that when I kind of listened into the community that formed around circling and like tuned into the language patterns, right? The lingo, if you will, that kind of developed out of that. They were like Heideggerian language. And I remember kind of catching whiff of that. And I was like, oh, very funny. Because I had no idea actually what the connection was between what I was reading and what I was practicing with circling and developing. And I realized that, oh, okay, with reading Heidegger, what I was tuning into there was essentially the phenomenology of what it takes to actually see, like what is most near to us, which is ourselves and the world. And so kind of going through this kind of like hermeneutic circle over and over and over again, stepping so outside of my own frame of reference to look back and try to understand what he was saying, was in some sense teaching me how to see and how to see something most near and how to ask questions, um, that you could say kind of are more primordial. And that ended up being a huge part of what circling is, right? Is this kind of deep inquiry into what is.
What
And
came? Yeah, go
that's
on.
how we connected, right? Like, and then I started seeing your videos, um, because I've like, um, having no academic background in this kind of thing, right? Like I've just been kind of on my own with it. Um, uh, and so I've watched all the videos on Heidegger, at that point, by the time I saw yours. And I remember your videos coming on, and there was distinctively remember there's a particular feeling of reading genuine philosophy and Heidegger. It's for me specifically Heidegger, where this kind of mystery opens up, or this sense of the thing that's most near starts to tremble or quake or reveal itself. It's hard to describe it, but I remember like watching your videos and having that feeling, and I'm like, that. And then I saw you had I think at that point you had maybe 500 like subscribers or something like that, and
less.
and then I contacted you, and then we had this conversation, and here we are.
I think 2. I think you can subscribe to yourself. So that was 1, as I, and then you. So I think my mother may have been the 3rd one. Yeah, but and now all the others now have just paying people off to come, but it's all about those clicks and hits. That's what we do it for.
Right.
Yeah, but I think the ones that you were listening to, I remember, were lectures on Parmenides and Heraclitus, I think. And there wasn't that much else up there at the time. But the say those were, I don't know what these lectures are. I mean, they're still up there, but whatever
your first also your first conversation with Ivo Di Gennaro too was up there too.
Yes, Ivo Di Gennaro was my professor in Italy. He never mentioned the name Heidegger. So what I studied was philosophy, politics, and economics, which was mostly economics. So I actually studied economics, very, very mathematical economics, in 3 languages, with a lot of law. And so in Italy, law is a foundational part of any economics degree. And there's one outlier, which was the class by Ivo Di Gennaro on Introduction to Philosophy B, 2nd semester. But what was striking is that the name Heidegger wasn't mentioned. We read Plato's Cave, excerpts from Kant, some of the lesser known texts, I think from the Anthropology, for example, a bit of Aristotle from the Metaphysics, Tito on, what are beings or what is being, Tito on. But if you translate this, it's not translatable, but there's no verb, there's no what is, there's just Tito on, which could be what beings or das Sein den or what being. That's debatable how to translate it. By the way, there's something that's untranslatable also in Aristotle, which is toti enenai in the Metaphysica, which you in the Löd Classics edition that I have, the green one, sometimes it's translated as essence or formal cause, which completely distorts the meaning. It's more, Paul Natrop translated as that which was being. That which was being. Being is that which was and which we remember. So, which we remember by beginning to listen. And I would invite anyone to reread the texts again. And just as a side note, it's not scholarly opinion. There are no 4 causes in Aristotle. He never speaks of 4 causes. This is a scholastic mistranslation. And there's so much still to be discovered, which is concealed just right there in front of us. And what Di Gennaro did, though, in the lecture course, what happened, I had ancient Greek at school. So I mean, at what you would call high school, at gymnasium, Latin and ancient Greek. And even though, so Heidegger wasn't mentioned, didn't matter. This is 2008. I think within a couple of minutes in the first lecture, the word logos was written in Greek on the whiteboard. Of course, I think about 3 people or so could read it. And the Italians actually have a stronger background in classical education than the Germans, so there were mostly German and Italian students in the classroom. But what was noticeable that the way of thinking is a Greek way of thinking. So Heidegger is a Greek thinker in the truest sense. He can think in terms of, and this is difficult to explain. One must learn the language. The language which is, when you translate it, is one which always conceals, because it doesn't need as many words, for example, than for example the German requires to translate a Greek sentence. But
like
also
the middle voice, right?
Oh, the middle voice.
Yeah.
So the middle voice is completely untranslatable in English. It's almost untranslatable into German. The middle voice, the medial form. The Heidegger mentions in the paragraph 7 of Being in Time, where he speaks of the finest I. So phenomai means I appear, but finest I is it's appearing, but in something else. So if we have Heraclitus's physis cryptistai philae, doesn't mean that nature likes to hide herself or itself, but it is physis rising out of itself that conceals or absconds or disappears in another. But it is only ever appearing in this disappearing in something else, which is not it and never will be it, through this schism between and so just to maybe get this across, that what Heidegger is after is not completely random, but anyone who learned ancient Greek will be able to see that there's something in his way of translating aletheia, etc., that is very close to the Greek way of thinking. And yeah, so the strangest thing though is that you can put this out now on YouTube, and and all the right or wrong people will come together. But it this is something maybe that indirectly we're all circling at this point. There's a gentleman, I don't know if I should mention his name or not. Maybe I'll actually mention him in my book also. By the way, you've been acknowledged in my book as well. I don't know if you've seen that one, but
totally. Thank
Leo,
yes.
Leo, I'll just mention his name. Doesn't matter. Leo Harrington is a former professor of mathematics at Berkeley, and he's now become part of this circle. And I think I'm not going to speak for him, but as far as I can tell, it's quite enlivening for someone who may not have been extremely bright and sharp and intelligent, but also maybe not as fits, not as easily pigeonholed or pigeonholable, if that's even a word.
Yeah. He didn't quite just fit in the clean category of mathematician at Berkeley. Yeah.
I would, yeah, I'm not, this is my suspicion, but I think so. Yeah. Tell me more about circling.
Well, just the thing about, see, this is what's interesting to me. It's just this, right? This thing about that, what you said about Aristotle. There's still so much there to learn that's concealed right before us. That's basically the same thing that circling is recognizing that that there's that most of the way things disclose themselves to us is through their withdrawal, right? It's like it's like with sound. You don't really hear sound; you hear sound withdrawing, right? You think you hear noise, right? There's you actually hear it. It's a vanishing away, right? And so when you listen to somebody else, right, talk about their lives, right, in some sense, you don't really know what you're hearing. However, it starts to you both start something starts to speak to you, and where you end up, where the conversation ends up, is revealing not even what you thought you were saying, but you find out what you were responding to the whole time and that you didn't ever have words for. And these kind of revelations end up being quite life changing. But I don't think that's the point. That's not why to do it, right? It's right. It's why to do it is that seems to be what it is to be genuinely human, is to dwell in being here and opening up to it and engaging in skole. So right now I think that the area I think I'm moving into is starting to do a lot more writing, and I'm working on a piece right now of re looking at circling from the standpoint of skole, right?
Hmm.
of of because I think that if we look at it in terms of a practice, I think that's the thing that we're practicing, is kind of dwelling in a space, right? Or a place, and listening to what's happening right now, um, from a non-utilitarian, right, kind of
Yeah.
place, but from as an end in itself, in some sense, and listening to it, revealing itself to it, and developing in relationship to that, right, and genuinely being in the being mode, if you will. So I think circling is the practice of of practicing being. It's practicing dwelling together and really genuinely listening.
And one scolaire, if you want to dwell on it, maybe. So I know probably what you mean, but maybe not everyone.
Right. Well, I think I'm not even sure if I know exactly what I mean by skole, but the, my understanding is that, well, the misunderstanding of skole, we can start off there. How I would piece it together is it's usually translated as leisure,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And it's usually that it's got that kind of economic understanding of, that when all the work's done, you work so as to have leisure, right? So you have this free time.
yeah,
But the problem with that is that it doesn't, you don't really understand. I don't think you can understand skole if you think about, unless you actually understand what it's doing in relationship to time itself, right? um so I think what a lot of people understand as leisure is they work really hard and then they have this free time, and it's
yeah,
basically the same time as when they're working, it's just unoccupied,
yeah,
and therefore you fill it up with whatever's entertaining, right, with Netflix or right, video games or whatever that is. But what I think, what skole, my understanding is what Aristotle talked
yeah,
about it,
yeah, yeah,
is that it's not it's not just free time, but it's, how do you put it, it's where it's where in it's this, it's like the space of time itself, right? It's dwelling in a place that you're not doing anything in particular, but it's what you're doing is recognizing, in some sense, the generation of the space of time itself, right? So another way of putting that is you're not doing things as a means to an end, right? The thing that you're doing is is recognizing the end in itself, right? So it's got this kind of sense of particular unity, in which what happens there can really, what I hear Ivo de Janeiro talk about, is where something genuinely can be decided, right?
yeah,
Where, if you want to call it, genuine insights can happen, where um, a deep sense of learning can happen. But you could say, in some sense, it's the point
mm,
of being human, right?
yeah,
And kind of dwelling there. So in that
yeah,
sense, as you cultivate that, it's not this, it's in some sense it's what rests underneath your experience of time and space that never goes away, right? But it's the authentic confrontation with it, if you will, and dwelling there. That's how I've been making sense of it.
There's just briefly to come back to something you mentioned about music. There's a very good student of one of my actually he's done 3 courses now, and one of them was early Greek philosophy. His name is Taylor Steinberg. I think he lives on the West Coast as well, and he's a drummer. So I don't know how he started out as a drummer, but he also plays jazz drums. And he gave what we did in the early Greeks course, avoiding the label pre-Socratics, which insinuates that before Socrates there was philosophy, which there wasn't, because they didn't think of themselves as philosophers, but there was a very different way of thinking. And early Greek is already a bit of a label too, but at least not kind of categorizing as all leading up to Socrates and then the rest. However, so Taylor, so the usual story of Parmenides, textbook Parmenides is being, and being is being is being, and everything's in full being present, and what we think is being is as this presence. But he has a passage where, and this of course is up for debate whether he actually here attacks Heraclitus or so, but he does seem to say that that which is absent should be considered ap eonta, should be considered just as present as what is not absent. And this led Taylor to give a talk on jazz drumming, and saying that there's sometimes this few things that you cannot really cannot quantify, which is what was it? Swing. It just says swing on the notes, but it cannot be instrumentalized, quantified, etc. You can only add it by listening to what is not yet there or what is currently disappearing. And I think Taylor also made the point during one of the seminars, and he said it much more beautifully than me, that but then even jamming together requires just this, to listen to what is not yet, what has not yet occurred, what has not yet come, what is not yet, or what is, so strangely enough, which is disappearing, but which is at the same time not yet appearing. So you're always in between space, or in an in between time of a space or space of a time.
Yes, absolutely. That I think that's what I'm imagining Skole is, right? Is it's in some sense is listening to that, dwelling in that, finding oneself in that, and in some sense, the way that we talk about it in circling is the purpose of why we're circling, or what the intention of is, that we're just simply, it's the practice, we're practicing profoundly being with what is, and the way, there's a bunch of different forms that can take, but one way is like somebody, kind of in some sense is the one who everyone brings their attention to in the group, and we just start going, well, like what's happening, and essentially they start talking about their lives, right? Or they start talking about what's happening in the present moment, and then we start to listen, and then from that place we start to just get into a deeper relationship to what's there through listening, and what's amazing about that to me is that you do it's interesting, it's like you start to encounter, oftentimes I've noticed this in circling, is um first of all, the first thing, just like any practice, it, where you're cultivating some capacity, right? the first thing that you find out is like the first thing that you notice is like, okay, I'm just going to practice being with what is. Is the moment that you start, once you start practicing that, is the moment you realize that you've hardly ever done that. Right? You've hardly ever, like, it's like once you put attention on actually listening, because everyone thinks that they listen. Everyone thinks that they listen. I mean, no one walks around thinking that they don't listen. But the moment, I can guarantee you, because I've seen this with thousands of people at this point, the moment you start exercising listening is the moment people realize that they've never listened, right? And that's that's the that's the paradox. It's like that seems to be the prerequisite to getting listening, is to realize that you don't. And until you can hear that you don't listen, right? Listening isn't possible. But the moment you realize that you don't listen is the moment you start to hear listening, right? It's like once you hear that you're not listening is the moment that you're listening to what listening is. And that's the moment where listening awakens, right? And that's
But you,
because I don't know how. Yes.
sorry,
Go
just to interrupt you here, just just to show how much I'm listening, because I've got these prepared questions. No, actually not. I'm just taking notes that I have to get to, and you've been, going on for a long time. But so you're on listening, okay? But but this is something that happened during your recording with Justin, with Murphy. Or he said, "Oh, maybe I've never been listening," because I just want to get to the next question. But so because this is striking, right? In this heyday of podcasting and listening to, I'm just on my way to work, I'm listening to podcasts, etc. Are you listening? But the way you've just described it, I mean, when so I've tried to listen. You said you hear listening. So to stay with this, you're not this. It sounded like, at least, you're not describing, almost not even some subjective act of, well, I'm pricking up my ears now, but there's a hearing of listening. There's almost like a listening is forming to come back to this, a time of a certain space in which something occurs, and that's listening. And this is what we then harken back to, almost like a gathering, right? And that's what we hear. So we're not talking really about these are my okay. My friend Max Gottschlich always says that your ears, they're not ontic substrate hear apparatuses, machines. They're not ontic hearing machines. The ear is the ontological appearance of something much more profound, which is hearing and listening himself. This is a Hegelian speaking, by the way. So maybe, I don't know, just I'd like to hear more on
totally.
this hearing listening.
Totally. Well, I could tell, all you got to do, right? If you think about it like this, is just to bring it just in a very, like, in some way, bring it right home, literally. And just ask your wife, ask your husband, ask your boyfriends, girlfriends, your family. Just ask them this question. Like, what have you been trying to tell me that I haven't heard yet? That I haven't been able to hear? And almost guaranteed they're going to have something to say, right? And, right?
Yeah, definitely.
That's like right there, right? Like you'll hear about it, right? So it's not. You're right. We're not talking about some sound that you barked out that I didn't auditorily hear. Hearing and listening aren't necessarily the same thing, right? It's like our ears can hear noise, but we can only listen to music, right? Like in some way, it's there's something else going on there. But I think what ends up happening is that when you realize, like, oh, I haven't heard that. What you actually hear, right, is that there's a way, that there's no listening. There's a way you listen. There's the way that you listen. And that you realize that you think that I've been listening to you, but what I've actually been listening to is all of my pre-listenings, all of my, all of my
Yeah, yeah.
always already ways of seeing the world, and I'm actually only hearing what I already think. And
Hmm.
so when you have these moments where
Hmm.
you, for example, in circling or in that question that I just kind of proposed, or these moments where you set up a situation where something can kind of break through, where you realize, oh, the moment I try to consciously listen is the moment I realize that I don't, right? But what I'm hearing when I don't, what I'm hearing in that moment that I don't listen is I'm hearing that there's a way that I listen, and I hear my listening. It's the moment a listening awakens because I'm starting to listen to my own listening, right? And the moment you do that, there's like a stepping back, if you will, right? And you can start to realize, and this is where a lot of people have a profound amount of insights about themselves, right? They realize, like, on some level they have maybe a listening for their whole lives have been for a listening for safety, like they're listening, right, for danger, or they're listening for, do you love me, or they're listening for, um am I good enough, or they're listening for, right, where's the danger, right? And so they hear everything in terms of that, and then they constantly respond to things in terms of that, and it becomes a kind of like a self-sealing loop. And so when you actually hear that loop is the moment you start to hear something beyond that loop, and a whole world opens up. And to me, that's a very philosophical moment, right? that's it's like it's like at that moment it's like a whole horizon opens up in that moment that can start to pour in. Because I think it's like Heidegger even said, like, maybe it's a good idea that you start to hear something be, beyond what you already think. Maybe it's a good idea.
As yeah, I, hmm. I, the philosophically, what this, or in terms of thinking, what this point, I mean, the conundrum that perhaps that once you, because while listening, one can make associations,
Mhm,
right? And
mhm,
then if you try to, and I've done this the whole time now, while trying to continue to listen to the flow, but then at the same time you could say, okay, how what kind of a presupposition or premise, I don't like premise because it sounds syllogistical, but what kind of a presupposition is there already, um, that that or almost, or maybe just an hypothesis on which I stand, that then I try and come back to every single time I listen, or one listens to what's being said.
yeah,
Um, and philosophy is itself perhaps now, or thinking in a moment that it must begin to listen again to what is
mhm,
being handed down through the text which built it. Because very often in academic philosophy, but also in the non-academic philosophy, which will suffer from the same issues if if it just provides a 15-minute summary, or a guaranteed learning outcome in a course, etc., which is why I
mhm,
completely refrain from these. Um, why am I saying this? I think that if you, um, for example, and this is, so you said in the circling experience, um, they all, some participants always already hear what they've always already heard.
yeah,
I'm trying to listen for safety. I'm trying to listen for this. But when we listen to philosophy, or the thinking of the texts of thinkers, do we listen to what scolaire, for example, could also mean?
yeah,
If
yeah,
scolaire is just leisure, then we're just back with the dialectics of work and leisure. If
yeah,
ethos is just character, well, then all that Aristotle describes is how one can form one's character to be excellent in the world. I was thought, for example, that arete, which is excellence or virtue, cannot be translated. There's no word in German that can encapsulate this. Logos was the same. Scholae comes from echein. Echein means to have and to hold. So scholae it can be thought of as the realm in which the human being finds a stance in the midst of being, so that the ethos as dwelling ground can be provided for the human being underneath the sky as a mortal being. And that is, that all of a sudden the text is completely different. Then perhaps whenever scolaire is mentioned, it's not actually as soon as we have secured everything materially, then we have some scolaire. But no, it's there will be no one way of translating it also is measure of sufficiency. Without a measure of sufficiency before, a coming to one's own, without this measure of sufficiency, nothing will ever be enough. And of course, circling is interesting as a name because, as you know, Hegel wrote the Encyclopedia, encircling the life of spirit or of the absolute idea. But also Parmenides speaks of the of aletheia as oikyklos, which means as well-rounded aletheia, and on a cycle or on a circle, the beginning is where you are. The inception is the end, and the end is the inception at any moment on the circle. So you come back to where you have always been, but of course you must go out in order to return home. There's no just staying, but there is a need to go out, but then to return. And this is then, however, so then of course the question is, how does this then differentiate itself from a self-sealing loop? That seems to be different, right? Because then the loop is kind of it's also, we could say, but that's also a circle. But how would you say that's different?
Well, I think it's different. It's in that moment of recognizing that I didn't hear all of it, right? Or I haven't heard you, or there's that moment of like something. It's like literally something opens up. That's it, in some sense, the whole circle's revealed at that moment, right? Because you're on one level, you realize what you're standing on isn't what you thought you were standing on, but it's also revealing. It's also revealing that not only what you're standing on in that moment wasn't what you thought you were standing on, but there's that also moment where the past that you thought you had, you thought you were understanding the whole thing the whole time, and it turns out you weren't understanding the whole thing the whole time. So you get kind of a new past in that moment, right? And then the future of what's coming has a new horizon, because now you understand that like you didn't understand. There's in some sense, I think that's how you break out of that circle, right? Is this recognition of that you were in a circle in some sense that opens up. There's a new horizon that opens up there, right? And in that sense, it's more like a spiral than it is like a closed loop. I have a very modern problem. My automatic vacuum cleaner just went off. I got to shut it off.
Yeah, if you want to go on, go on.
Yeah, there's because it's interesting, because if you think about this in terms of like temporality, this is often, I think, moments of insight are like this. Also, moments of things can be really traumatic. I mean, you're going to talk about it psychologically. Moments of trauma are like this too, where you're going along and you think that you're happily married, and then all of a sudden you find out that your wife has been cheating on you for the last 15 years, right? let's say, right? In that moment, the second before you found that out, you had a particular past. You were you, and you were in a marriage, and you knew what the marriage was, and it was a loyal marriage, and da 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 da, and you're moving towards that. And but in that moment, you find this out, right? And you realize, well, who you're with isn't who you thought you were with, right? And not only now, but who you were with the last 15 years. So the history that you had, right, is not the history that you had, right? And and then there's the whole question of the future. You have a whole new future in that moment, right? That's in some sense that's a traumatic moment, but it's also, you can start to realize those moments about like when you have an insight about where you are, right?
Yeah.
So it's like that in some sense. I think when you, and this is in some way the risk of listening, right? This is why I think things like philosophy and circling and, opening up awareness practices, these kinds of things, is where you open it up. This is why it takes courage, because what you're opening up to is, you're opening up to in some sense, you're opening up to recognizing that you're more than you can ever imagine. You can more than you can ever conclude. That, like, what you're dwelling in is more than you can ever think. And that's, in some sense, you're risking some kind of secure ground in that way. That's why I think it takes a lot of courage to genuinely ask questions about things.
I mean, we can. Okay. So there's a non-linearity, I would guess. So the searching and finding are not a linear tension field, but it's open.
Yep.
And any finding, any searching, or any finding, any finding leads to another search, we could say.
Yeah.
Whereas the self-sealing loop is a feedback loop that is always already, well, strangely enough, linear on its own curve, but completely closed off, and there's no twofoldness or ambiguity about it. It knows its own feedback before it even occurs. So it's just it generates its own feedback, obviously, and it's just, as any musician will know, if you use a kind of a loop in any of your software, it's just going to sound the same over and over and over and over. Right. It's also striking that our music is beginning to sound like this in general, without much spontaneity. And by the way, one could actually make the point that feedback loops are almost everywhere. And that even a certain way of academic writing is basically a feedback loop, where you have to feed back to all the right knots in the system and quote them, and then get into it. But this is not this kind of an opening up that is still a cycling or circling around, but a very different one, it seems. Opening.
I would say yes. I just want to kind of point at this, is that I think that I would have to say that also what you're describing is that it's the cyber internet world that we live in too.
Yeah.
Well, right. I think that we dwell in expecting things to be immediately intelligible, right? We've literally.
So sorry. I think but also no, as you know, because look, there are two village idiots, you and me, who live in their little humble abodes, thousands of miles apart. Thankfully, we've never met. No,
Yes, yes.
No, I mean, would be really? You thought you were taller. Just two dwarfs. Yeah, okay. But um, what I'm thinking is, so that's true. This, you mentioned cybernetics. Kybernetein means to steer, um, which is also a Greek word, not actually a new word. Interestingly, when we speak of cyberpunks, we have a certain aesthetic connotation or association, but at the same time, this kind of free form, the free form dialogues that are flourishing, that are not timed. Um, these are not. No, this is our 15 minutes podcast with Guy Sengstock today as my guest, and let me get to all the questions I have. They are so. We have on the one hand the sort of the mechanism is a feedback loop, but it generates, I think, involuntarily all of these escape routes.
Yeah, yeah.
So as the more you want to have this completely and in its, as you put it, self-sealing loop that is completely self-consuming, it generates all of these escape routes, where all of a sudden it's become. Of course, the question is, are people really listening or not? Maybe not everyone is, and certainly you cannot listen all the time to everything. It is maybe also just a whole lot of noise. And a strange kind of cacophony as well, which we have to maybe also consider. But at the same time, it opens up a way of being able to teach or speak with others in a way that perhaps was of course not impossible before, because that would be ridiculous to say. But there wouldn't have been this kind of a possibility concretely to have dialogues on topics that are almost ineffable, but which are now, strangely enough, in this uncanny wheelwork of the cybernetic feedback loop, become more possible, and there's a more of a radical openness to them than perhaps before. So at once, of course, there's still the consumption of sound bites. Give me Nietzsche in 10 minutes, give me Heidegger in 15 minutes. Yeah. But at the same time, we are engaging in dialogues that, as you know, bring people into a circle in which all of a sudden they become, it's ecstatic in the sense that it takes them out of their
contingency. Looping contingencies. And that precisely that space, and it is a kind of ecstatic space, if you will. I appreciate what you're saying too. It's like, I really do think there's something fascinating about the way that what's happening in these longer form kinds of conversations, right? It's one of the few places. I mean, I'm sure there's many others that I'm not even thinking about, but it's one of the few that I'm aware of where technology has created something that opens up a space that doesn't lead to more technology. It's
turning.
Inherently untechnological.
It's always a turning. It's always a turning, right?
Yeah.
So kehre so it's not dialectical. And dialectical, by the way, in this ridiculous sense of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which is what some of the accelerationists make history out to be. A turning cannot, you could not. So we've spoken of a spiral. A spiral is one way of imagining, but try and imagine a perfect spiral. That's if you're honest, that's impossible. A turning cannot be imagined at all. It can be, but you can kind of see turnings all the time. And I want to mention this briefly. There's a note by Nietzsche. So note means this was published posthumously. It's not part of any published book. To my knowledge, it's only available in German and Italian. Where Nietzsche, this is in the late 1880s, when Nietzsche speaks of, this is a quote, what's inevitably in store for us today is the total economic management of the earth. There's an uncanny or an enormous, a monstrous wheelwork, which reduces the level of man, a reduction in the niveau of the human being, where the human being becomes a cog, an adapted wheel in an ever more enormous, monstrous wheelwork. But then he continues that this must, as of necessity, he says, generate also another, and Nietzsche's language is always a bit misleading, especially for us today. He says another higher type. I don't think he would mean anyone of those who steer the cybernetic feedback loops as the technocratic leaders, but rather the creative types who can see the escape routes in, for let's just say, technology, and then begin to play with it. And Heidegger, for example, never says, I want to get rid of technology. He says, how can we find a free relationship with technology? With this over enframing, how can, if enframing becomes very visible, that means you see the frame, right? Once you see the frame, you kind of ask, how do I break out of the, what's the exit? Or maybe even just, in a ridiculous, just take the frame and put it somewhere else, and just skip out. And because one turning, it isn't just, it's the other side of here's a coin, I turn it, here's another side of the coin. It's not, there's no sides. It's a turning, which is in a turning, which is in a turning, which is in a turning, which is itself as it's turning, concealing, but also revealing. So any kind of this playfulness, perhaps, of these circling dialogues, they generate something ecstatically, which is completely unforeseen, and we don't know where it's going, or how it may be, maybe even corrupted at some point or so. But at the same time, it's
and even that generation. It's on one level, it's like it creates or it generates, but it also reveals in its generation what it didn't see while it was concealed, and that awareness of that playfulness, right, seems to be where we get, like, where human beings can exist, right? Like, it's where we can find our being, right? Is in that sense in which this is what's striking to me is that it's always valid to ask. I can't think of a moment where it's not valid for me to ask, what am I not hearing? Right? Like, I can't think about it. Like, is there a point in my life where that's not a valid question? What am I not hearing right now? What am I not seeing right now? What is it that I'm assuming that isn't totally the whole picture? Like that's always can be asked, right? Seems to reveal something about where we're at, both its openness but also its concealedness, right? And I think that's the attunement that I've come to. I hope to keep appreciating, because I don't think there's appreciating. I think there's always just coming to deeper and deeper appreciation to it, which is, in some sense, that that the I don't know, the source from our, like, the ground of our lives, the source of our humanity, if you will, what makes us human, is this recognition that concealment is, right, like, we can hear concealment, right, that we can that that there's some relationship that we have with the ineffable, um and that we can start to hear it, right, and we can come into relationship with what is yet revealed, but we can still hear it and listen for it, and that relationship with that, right, to be able to kind of listen to silence, to listen to what I don't understand, to kind of know that for everything that I can see, there's also always a horizon, right, which that seeing is both revealing and concealing, and that we can tune into that concealment and listen to it, right, and that listening to it and that opening it to it seems to be, in my estimation, it seems to be what leads to these things that we admire about people, right? It leads to kind of genius and creativity and all the things that seem to evoke things that at least I really admire in people.
You could maybe almost say that Heidegger's asking us to engage in such a listening with the tradition,
Yeah, yeah,
to be able to be open to what
yeah,
not not what should have been thought or what actually was forgotten, but
yeah,
what is there and hiding, as it were, in plain sight.
yeah,
The it's on the Aristotle is on her on being as being. What what's what the tradition doesn't think specifically is the as, the he, being as being. How is it that being as being reveals itself to us? How is it that there is a presence in which something is present? So this being as being, for example, being as, and this is why and Heidegger, who begins to see this, can then begin to see the tidings or the weirdness or the abidings of being and how we understand being in any given uh, epoch.
yeah,
And yeah,
right. That's and that. Okay, so that right there, and that's so rich. I mean, just what you're like what you're presencing there with Heidegger's saying we can have that relationship, right? Of what I'm hearing you say is that what I'm hearing you say that Heidegger is basically saying is we can have a relationship with what is traditional, right? With the traditions, such that we can actually listen to it in such a way with an understanding that I'm not hearing the whole thing yet, right? That there's more mystery here. There's more here to listen to than I understand right now, right? And I there's an it brings to mind this part. I think it was Heidegger was it's something he wrote I think in the 60s. It was towards the end of his life. Time and Being. Um, an article, and he starts off the article where he says, I think it's at he's like, perhaps it'd be a good idea, right, if we were to stand before a painting, right, and some artist, right, and look at it for a long time and not demand that it be immediately intelligible, right? And he kind of talks about like, and if Heisenberger were here and he was talking about his formulas, right? Most of us, maybe one or two people, would even be able to comprehend anything that he was saying. And while the rest of us would, without protest, not demand that it be immediately intelligible. And he kind of goes through two or three iterations of this, right? And he says, not so with philosophy, right? We seem to demand of philosophy that it be immediately intelligible and demand that it actually deliver for us the good life, right? Um, and and then he kind of goes on and then he kind of culminates and he sets up the rest of the lecture with this line that I just think is so, been thinking about it for 25 years and I keep thinking I know what it's saying and then I realize I don't know what it's saying, right? Like and he says, let me give you a hint on how to listen to the lecture. Do do not listen to it. Do not listen to a series of propositions. Instead, follow the movement of showing. Right. So it's kind of like in that line right there. I think that's there's so much in that, right? Because if you think about it, don't listen to the lecture. Or you could say, don't listen to your wife, or you don't listen to the tradition, or don't listen to anything, right? That's as a series of propositions, which means if you think about a proposition, what can I do with the proposition? I can agree with it or disagree with it, right? I can refute it. So it's like if we refrain from listening to it as that, right, something else opens up, right? A movement, right? And it's interesting because you think about this. He's like, okay, we can begin to follow the movement of showing, right? Like it's not just follow the showing; it's
And-
follow movement of showing, right? That other thing that shows itself, that flickers, um,
yeah, and there's
that's
no
what
guarantee,
opens up.
and
Yeah,
there's no guarantee it will show.
yeah,
And so
exactly.
a propositional argument, you can repeat all the time, and it can be completely meaningless, right? As long as the syllogism, as long as you agree with the premises, you can repeat the syllogism completely denying time. But the Gründungsgeschehen, so the betiding of a grounding, is not repeatable. It's not repeatable. It either occurs or it doesn't. Of course, we can listen to this recording again and again, and of course, we can read, for example, texts by Heidegger again and again. But they're not informational value. They require always a listening and a going along with that which might open up by itself, and also by that which we can as responders to, right? Because this opening up is not just, even if this is a recording and people listen to this is not just here is information which we communicate to you in our infinite wisdom. No, there is a response on the side of the listener. As much as you and I are listening to each other, those who listen to a dialogue such as this will be responding to that which reveals and discloses and unconceals itself, and at the same time bring in another concealment and be able to hear what we haven't heard, but which to some was beckoning or hinting itself also. And this is not never repeatable, never. But technology wants to do something else entirely, right? Technics, Gestell. It wants to interfere and say, no, it can all be repeated all the time. It's all just a format. Here's your romantic weekend 10 years before you go. You can book it. And here's, you can live your life in a
All
digital.
without buttons.
Yeah.
All without even pressing buttons, right?
Oh yes, no more buttons. That's too much to ask. We're too weak. But it would be too much suffering. I just want to get rid of my body entirely. No. But so what it does is it perverts a Gründungsgeschehen, something where something could really occur and be tied in and of itself, in its own right, and then we have to own up to this. So it cannot be faked. It cannot but I mean, a genuine listening cannot be faked, right? It cannot be. By the way, this is what's so brilliant. But all this talk about everything will be automated, blah blah blah. Well, guess who will never be automated? The listeners and the thinkers. There will be no automation of this. So maybe just if someone's young enough, think about what you want to study and what you want to devote your life to. Is maybe something genuinely human that will never be automated away. And in any Gründung, in any grounding, there's, which cannot be repeated, which is unique and einmalig, which is only one time that it can occur, is a gathering, as it were, of a gathering which looks at us. It looks at us and it addresses us, and we are addressed by it, and then respond to it. And as we respond, it disappears. As it responds, it rescinds, it absconds into it. So the minute we try to grasp it too much, it slowly evaporates. So perhaps the art is always, and this cannot be, there's no formula for this, but it's in a heeding of language, which is which is profoundly related to listening, to a heeding of listening. Is that a clearing and a grounding occurs, and this kind of a grounding, this is ultimately what can lead to a genuine serenity. And I think, the striking phenomenon to me then is that this is not becoming possible thanks to technology, not allowed thanks to technology. I'm not trying to say it's enabling anything, but it's possible regardless of the operations of technology.
Yeah.
It's possible regardless of this over formatting of the world and of our so-called experiences.
Yeah.
So
So when you said, I felt quite struck by something you just said. You said, I think you said basically like, said what is, well, one is that something's addressing us, right? Something's, guys. I think about this sense of like, when Plato talked about the look of, it's the look of things. It's funny, for the longest time, I never really heard that as the look that shows its look that I look at. I always saw it as like it looks out and the look addresses us, right? Maybe that's my dyslexia, or maybe I was actually hearing what he was actually saying. But I heard that sense of which one is to be human is to be addressed by something, right? And to be in response to that address, right? And that's not repeatable, right? And that thing, that what is most human is that which cannot be formatted and repeated.
Yeah.
And I when you said that, like, it's like you had your hands right at your heart, right? And I felt that in my heart, right? And but wouldn't you say, Johannes, so that we are in this strange time? In my estimation, it seems to me that we are in the age of technic.
Yeah.
Given that it's not just that we have technology, but that we have a technological understanding of anything that is, right?
Yeah.
Is that if we don't guard that place of what is most human, right? It's not like it'll just keep being there. Like that I think that what makes this time, the time that it is that if we don't safeguard that which is unrepeatable, unformattable, right? That which that sense of being addressed and being a response to that address, in its originality, i.e., what is most human. If we don't safeguard that, I think what my understanding is what makes this time is that it's not a guarantee that that's just going to be there by virtue of that we have a heartbeat, right?
Yeah. That's the danger. That is the highest. That's and this kind of reduction of the human being, or even worse than just a reduction. Always, of course, very often, not always, but very often comes along with a very moralistic voice, and content, but the danger is indeed that nothing will be heard anymore. But at the same time, one would perhaps have to point out that this complete enclosing in almost perhaps self-inflicted this neglect of listening to and being addressed by what could be there also is there in the beginning of what we now call philosophy, and it's there in the cave. So perhaps when I first read the cave, I was 16, I guess, during an ancient Greek class, and translating this, it struck me that some philosopher 2,500 years ago describes our world today. Describes what would have been, this is 20 years ago, would have been television. Today, of course, it's more the internet than back then. And being in a strange non-place where shadows, and by the way, not really shadows of anything real, but shadows of imitations already, or copies, that are memorized. And that's the game they play, they memorize. So they are already here, not listening to what is beckoning outside. But what is it that occurs on the way out? The one who leaves the cave returns back into it. And as you know, Heidegger often quotes, if not in every single one of the public talks and essays on technology, Hölderlin from the Patmos hymn. Hölderlin says, "Wo aber die Gefahr ist, wächst das Rettende auch." Where the danger is, there that which will save, or that which will protect, is also growing. And there is now something, of course, strange occurring with technology and this kind of. But what I think I would say though is, strikingly, whatever it is, it needs the human being. It needs us. It needs capital needs to flow through us. It's not it's not algorithm sending bitcoins to each other. No, it needs, for some reason, it needs our energy or whatever it requires. And that, as long as that is still visible, and it's there is no. Then I think also in this, even just the simplest dialectics, which is completely superficial, where we have a very strong thesis going in one direction, the antithesis is necessarily coming. But the notion of this thought of the turning and the spiral and the turning is much stronger. I think that it's unforeseeable, right? You can almost say that technology, or in framing positionality, Gestell fools itself to assume that everything's already with certainty decided for. And any kind of unforeseen mishap along the highway can very easily shatter the entire enterprise. I think that there's no one can see the future, but certainly. I think Marx even sees this danger of capital, but then fantasizes about a liberation through the machines, etc. I think there remains, precisely in the moment of a greatest withdrawal, that's the hope. That this is where a clearing also begins to show itself. But this is the experience of Hölderlin. Hölderlin sees the gods disappear, sees divinities disappear. Heidegger speaks of the great fire that's extinguished all of a sudden. But rather than giving in or giving up, I'd rather go down, holding the torch up, holding up the torch, than just give in and say it's all for nil. Technology will take over, or whatever technology even is, because it's us who speak of it. It needs us. It requires us to even consider it, and at the same time, we can take very strange turnings all the time. And I would maybe, if I may, maybe I shouldn't utter a recommendation. Maybe I should just say this. One can draw, one can take sudden turns all the time as a human being. And that perhaps is where freedom is generated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My son, Forrest, who's a trip, I just came back from visiting him with my mom in Florida. He'll be 19 in September. There was a certain point in the trip where we kind of sat down, and I was finally able to, like, we had some privacy, and I was just like, so like, I asked him the question, like, how you really doing? And he looks at me, he's like, Dad, I'm having a total fucking identity crisis. And I was just like, I felt myself feel so relieved. I was like, thank God, right? Because I, that's what was my response to him. I was like, well, thank God you are, right? Because he's tells me something still, that he's not totally captured in some sense, right? Um, that he's having a crisis, that he's an enigma to himself, that he doesn't that these things aren't super clear and straightforward and formatted, and right, that there's something to wrestle with there. Is to me is it's that thing that that which is most human in us, right?
Yeah, he's in
But
touch with his death.
yeah,
He's dying.
yes, right.
That's an
Right.
identity crisis, not even strong enough. He's dying.
Yeah.
His teenage self is dying. He's having to become a young adult, a young man. And as Hölderlin says, mortals die their death in life, not just once, but many times over. And it's through death that any possibility reveals itself.
Yeah.
And we can numb those death experiences, as you know, how we do, pills and therapy, blah, 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 or whatever else there is. But or you lean into it.
Right. Exactly. Do you know anybody who wrote any? Do you know any authors who wrote anything about that?
I don't know. I wouldn't know anyone. No.
The thing I appreciated about your book is this very visceral sense, where the way that there's that way that at least the sense I got from it was I'll put it something like this: to the degree that you're actually fully living towards your death, right? It's to the degree that you're standing, it pushes you back out and you stand up, right? This kind of sense, that's the sense I really got from that, right? That's what I heard in Forest, actually, and which I think you really picked up on is that sense of like, yeah, I'm having an identity crisis. In other words, I'm being stood up by what it is to be human, which is to know that that there's finitude, right? And therefore I have choices to make, and there's no guarantees about any of them. But that openness, a crisis, is another way of saying, in some sense, right, is a kind of a rupture or a break or an opening, right, to genuinely listening, right, without any guarantees. But it's funny, as we're talking, it's interesting. I'm just getting this sense of um, I think what I imagine what we're doing with Halcyon, right? The notion of the guild, right? What I'm kind of doing with circling is, in some sense, in this way that's not even like a business plan written out or something. It's not. I don't mean in that sense, but in some sense, I think maybe what we're responding to is, or what's addressing us, and we may be finding ourselves responding to, is this awareness of that, if that which makes us most human, that there's something about the epoch that we're in that if we don't safeguard that in some way, right? If we don't kind of like on some level draw out the outlines, right? In some sense, guard, I don't know if that's the right word, but in some sense, be aware of a danger that if we don't do that in some way, there is a danger of everything becoming formatted in some sense. So I think like one of the things I'm kind of getting in this conversation and kind of the flow of it and the feeling of it and the mood of it, there's kind of a sense of there's a no there's a sense of I feel a deep sense of care, right? A deep sense of care, uh, and a deep sense of wonder at the same time. Um, and I think ultimately what's circling, like my relationship to circling and my response to circling is in some sense is it's a way of an attempt or a response to addressing this sense of at the center of us, right? Is this what makes us human is to be open, to be addressed, and to be genuinely concerned for that we are, and to have ourselves be a genuine, as Heidegger would say, to, to be the being for which your being is a question, right? And for being itself can be a question. Now, the thing about that also, the horizons that opens up, right, is in some sense that's he kind of in some sense kind of another way of saying that human beings are free, right? But the moment that very freedom is the very freedom for which we can, the moment freedom opens up is the moment prison becomes possible, right? So it's like the 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 possibility for authenticity, right, is also the same horizon that opens up the possibility for inauthenticity. So it unless there's some genuine, I think, response or some genuine listening, I think is the key, is what we're talking about here. A genuine kind of caring for opening up to that human beings are the only, and, it's funny, it's like the phylogenetic chain. It's interesting to think about this. A human being is the only one where it says explicitly being, right? You don't see like, amphibian being or mammal being or, right, like insect being. But when it gets to human, it's human being, right? It, I think that's so telling, right? That to be human is so already to be of concern with that there is, right? And their whole life is in some sense, whether or not we know it or not, we're conscious of it or not, is a constant being a question in taking our own being up with ourselves and with being, and that ultimately that thing about being is addressing us, and that it's possible to not hear it. And so like these little moments, these places where like an opening where you can cultivate practices and attitudes and conversations which develop for one to become sensitive to be struck by being addressed, right, and respond, right, to the that fundamental mystery that we are, and genuinely care about it.
And lest we forget, you mentioned being in time, and that the being is an issue for Dasein, the being of the human being, this horizon in which we participate. Yeah. If a superficial glance at philosophy looks at this as just another book of theory, any book is just theory. It's just some theory about blah 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 about being in time. What is thinking? Well, thinking. Philosophy is one articulation of how thinking thinks itself. Being in time becomes a necessary question after Nietzsche dissolves everything into linear circular time, and Hegel completely dissolves time entirely. time begins to be necessary. So what I'm trying to say is, if being and time is written now, and this is not to say that any philosophy before was wrong or not good enough. This is not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is, it's a relatively recent text which breaks free from the imagination representation of the human being as a rational animal, for example, which is prevalent in technology. But there's already then another another beginning of thinking the human being as Dasein, as the openness to any openness, right? As open to any presence, for which its own being is an issue and a constant question. So there is here something beginning, and also a self-investigation that occurs in the text, which is transformative, which is itself, in pure just terms of years, very recent. But of course, and this becoming explicit is a becoming explicit that is now upon us. So there is in this age something like this being written, right? It's written now. It's written in our age, in our epoch, not 3,000 years ago. It's written now. It was written. It was written almost just yesterday when you think about it. But in terms of just pure, quantification of how old is civilization, yada yada, it's now being written. So there's now something awakening, you could say, and to thinking, you could say, is only just beginning, because philosophy has itself come into its end, and is it doesn't speak to us, right? Maybe it's interesting whether Spinoza is an idealist or not, or whether Kant actually is an inner Spinozist or not. These are scholarly questions that don't matter. That doesn't speak to us. What speaks to us is the question, more than any other, I think, what does it mean to be human? So this question is the one that is awakening, and the question is why, right? And it's, again, in these moments of as Hegel says, the owl of Minerva only springs its wings at dusk. It's in the moment of death when a crisis occurs, and a crisis meaning the need for making a decision, a clear cut, which and by the way, in this way, people look for authenticity, etc. What we can learn from Heidegger is that the authentic is never without the inauthentic. It's actually when the inauthentic begins to show itself fully that the authentic, it's only in the starkest contrast to the inauthentic that the authentic begins to light up. You are what you no longer are by remembering quite clearly what you no longer want to be like. And these, I have a record here behind me from Ella Fitzgerald. Not just, Summertime is Upon Us, beautiful song, but what is her life story? She's a kid from Harlem, at the worst time you could be a kid from Harlem, goes up on stage, wants to dance. Some twin pair from around the same area as her, Harlem, they go up on stage and they dance and they take the audience by storm. So she goes out in a snap position, is announced, I think, as a dancer, but it starts singing. And becomes Ella Fitzgerald. And becomes this jazz swing singer that wouldn't have come about without all of a sudden listening to something else that's possible also. All of a sudden. For no reason before given. Actually in an acceptance of fate, right? She didn't want to elude her fate in that moment. She accepted the fate that she may not be a good dancer. Accepting that fate, snapping out of it, ecstatically taking herself out of what should have been. So there's completely different temporality that opens up, boom, boom, boom. So the feedback loop is overcome, and it can be overcome all the time, especially when it begins to show itself. Because to speak biblically, the snake, you see the snake when it moves. So
yeah.
the
I.e., when it's already around your leg. Yes.
Well, but even then, the question is, then especially the question is, how strong, to speak with Nietzsche, how strong is your will to be free, and to actually, and that's so. None of this comes easy. None of this comes free, or cheap, and it
None of
never
it's already
has.
decided. Yeah.
No, the
Yeah.
human being is an undecided being, and I'd like to
Yeah.
stress this again. So this only just crystallized itself to me now, that when you were speaking about being in time, Dasein, or the human being whose being is an issue for the human being, that's when it crystallized to me that when was this text actually written? It was written indeed at the end of a great cycle. That's true, perhaps on some level, but at the same time, it was then written in a moment where this question apparently is becoming more relevant, more profound, and therefore also opening up something within the dimension of the human, which may have been concealed before.
Mm. Yeah. Can I read a poem
Please.
I wrote about this? It's been ringing in my ears for the last half an hour, so I figure I should read it. I wrote this a while ago. It's called The Most Asking Question. You planned it this way, didn't you, God? You knew to put yourself just out of our grasp. It's the space between where we must widen, oh so completely unfold, to feel the untouchable spot, ask the unanswerable question, and deny ourselves the never satisfied desire that constantly wiggles in our belly. Is this the place, God, the gap between you and I, that is the window where you stand and peer upon the making? Is that you feeling yourself in my strain? Is that you, God, sitting just behind my eyes as I look for you walking in circles? When the leaf dances delicately in the wind, and for a moment we trade places and beauty breathes me. Is that you satisfied? And is it me wanting more?
Thank you. I don't know, maybe I should say that because one thing in closing, perhaps on this poem. I don't know if it's on this poem, but there's something that struck me during writing the lectures for the German idealism course, which is that Schelling, who is struggling in his essay on freedom, which, as you know, is important to Heidegger, for example, also. He's struggling with time, with the question of time, and without having the language yet, he has these weird moments where there mustn't be any time when it comes to freedom, but then there is a life before life, so something. So not that it's decided, but he uses this metaphysical language before it was then made, well, opened up by Heidegger to speak of temporality in this completely different, non-metaphysical, non-linear way. And something that struck me especially during the writing of the Schelling lecture, is that in a post or non-Christian or whatever, no longer Christian world, with all the terrors that may bring or not bring, who knows? Thinking is also twisting free from something, right? It's twisting free from having to make sense of the Trinity, or or having to make sense of I don't know how, the individuation of the soul, which is so much.
Twisting free. I like that. Having
Yeah,
twist free. Yes.
no, but the pains at which Aquinas is to show that the soul exists before, because it's immortal, so it cannot have been generated or born. But how does it, how is it individuated in the body, which then dies, etc. The pains at which Hegel is to try and sort of, with the weirdest passages in the philosophy of religion, bring together the Trinity, and kind of justifying this overly symbolic language. This sort of this sudden disappearance of the meaning of this, at the same time, means a twisting free from trying to justify all of these rather bizarre ideas, and at the same time allows for, again, to come back to this, allows for thinking the human being and the place in the world of human being. Of course, at the same time, technology comes in and provides certain ready-made answers for the human being. By the way, quite often in a neo-Christian fashion, with promises of salvation, the afterlife, etc. But and this is just an age of transition, ultimately, also. But there is something else becoming possible. Nietzsche is already at the cusp of this. Rilke, I think, also, when he speaks of the bow and the insane tension which we're under. And at some point, the bow, once it's
the snap of release, it becomes more than itself. Yes.
Yeah, and don't underestimate, sort of, when we talk about the powers of technology and whatever that even means, is that what it requires, quite apparently, is a continuous increase in energy consumption. So it needs more and more and more. But the arrow, so it needs more tension, and it can never let go of its tension.
Yeah.
It can't, because once it does, it collapses.
Yeah.
So, but the arrow, which we are, this tension on the bow, that at some point must be released. And of course it can, because it's a unique moment, it can completely miss its target, if there even is a target, or its goal. Yes, but the tension will be released, and that in itself spirals out into twistings and turnings unforeseen. And reminding of ourselves, to come back to what you always point the finger to, I have been pointing the finger to the past hour, is reminding ourselves of the twistings and turnings, even just in our own lives, how often something completely unforeseen just happens, the strangers we run into, that's something to be mindful of, perhaps. It's very simple. It's very simple. It's very there's no grand utopia over there. That's not the point. These are very simple, small moments.
In that way, that simplicity and significance are unified, right? That sense of simplicity in the sense of, like, right, where we, like, it's usually like, when I say that was simple, what I'm really saying is I spent, after 20 years of racking my brains over this thing, I realized it was right in front of my face the whole time, but concealed, right? And necessary. That 20 years was necessary to reveal it as such, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's possible, and I can feel it right now, because I think you can cultivate this, and I think I watch people cultivate it, and it seems to be the source of character on some level, right? Which is this undecidedness, right? This kind of walking in circles, not knowing, like what you're responding to exactly, but understanding that you're not hearing the whole thing, but you can hear yourself not hearing, which is, and making that whatever that is, that you can actually cultivate wanting that. Like you can actually cultivate being attracted to that, right? And that I think is the challenge of our time. I think that's the challenge that I see is for people to wake up, like to stay awake, and not only to stay awake to that is, but to cultivate it and to want that undecided wrestling thing that you're wrestling with, right? To want to listen to concealment, to want to realize that you didn't know the whole everything, to want to in some sense to aspire for that as a source of character, um, and just in some sense safeguard those places, which in some sense I'm imagining is a bit of what has us talking right now, is on some level responding to that, right? And there's these kind of gatherings of people.
Yeah.
This is what's interesting about this. I do think that there's one thing about I've just come to appreciate, and uh, unrelenting in the amount that the horizon, what this horizon yields, right? Which is what's possible when two people genuinely enter into dialogue, right? It, it's to have a genuine conversation with people, right? To genuinely be with another, and to open to another being in language, right? There's no guarantee. By definition, you don't know what's going to come out of that, right? It may not go anywhere. However, what's possible when two people genuinely meet, right, is is if you just think about, if you could just think about, especially in it's interesting because I think I know I for the longest time had this idea that there was, okay, there was what is, and then there was how I made sense of it, right? Like that there was like a world, like kind of, I don't know, a Cartesian world, and most of it's not discovered, and we're kind of become the explorers, and we'll find out more about it and accumulate more facts, or but when you really look at it, like that's already a way in which it's intelligible to you. This kind of sense in which there's
Yeah.
being and intelligibility are, you can't separate them out, right? And so that what human beings are is open up. That we're open. We're particularly open to be concerned or find ourselves concerned about being, right, and to be addressed by it, and to be in response to it. And there's something that happens when you think about that and the relationship to the way we do that, right? The way that we care is by bringing is what we care about is what we talk about, or what we can care. A way of caring about it is, in some sense, I mean, I think you mentioned Aristotle, this sense of sounding out sense. If you think about all of that, right, and you think about what becomes possible in a conversation, which a conversation dwells in language, and we can start to bring and sound out what is of the deepest concern. What can open up are things that are beyond what you and I could even comprehend or even want to know, right? But a shift in understanding about, if you shift your understanding about
Yeah.
about being, it it, it it's not just you're not just informed. You just don't have more information.
No.
You're
Yeah.
formed, right? It'll shift. It can shift the way life occurs to you, and all of your actions are perfect, are in complete correlation to that occurring, right? So that I think conversation and dialogue, dialogos, circling the the philosophical conversation, genuine dialogue, sounding out sense. I that it just seems like it seems that I love that. It's a great way of being alive. In other words, let's
Yes.
keep doing this. I feel very
Yeah.
I feel very inspired by this conversation. I really appreciate
And
our conversations all the time.
same. And I think the art afterwards is to take these petals
Mhm,
that flow from it, right? And they are
mhm,
just
mhm,
snowflakes, as Chomsky says, I think, about being, doesn't he? Uh,
mhm.
then
Hmm.
the petals of language of which Heidegger speaks somewhere also, and to be able to not not use taxidermy and stuff them up and put them on the shelf. And, oh, look, here's this award from this conversation.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
how can this little flamelet, if there even is one, be heated
yeah,
or at least remembered? TNA9, Aristotle, that which has been being.
mhm,
How can it be
yeah,
remembered so that it delivers over into what is
yeah,
to come? And
yeah,
that's always where freedom. That's I think where freedom is generated.
yeah,
Um, and so, and yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
yeah.
But yeah,
Right, right, right. I love this conversation. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate what you're doing a lot.
likewise, Sarah.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Mwah.